Right now, obesity gets talked about constantly as a distinctly modern problem, tied up with fast food, desk jobs, and endless hours of scrolling instead of moving. It's easy to assume ancient humans simply didn't have this issue at all. That constant physical labor and food scarcity made obesity basically impossible before modern life came along. But the real answer turns out to be a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than a simple yes or no, and it involves some remarkably surprising archaeological evidence that pushes this question back much further than you'd expect. So let's dig into it properly. Did ancient humans ever actually become obese? And if so, under what circumstances, given how physically demanding survival was for almost the entirety of human history? Let's start with the most obvious, intuitive assumption, because it's not entirely wrong, just incomplete. For the overwhelming majority of human history, food scarcity was a constant, serious threat, and physical activity levels were dramatically higher than what most people experience today. Hunting, gathering, walking long distances, building shelter, processing food by hand, virtually every aspect of daily survival demanded sustained physical effort. Combine that with food supplies that were often unpredictable, seasonal, or simply insufficient, and you get an environment where excess body fat, in the sense we typically think of modern obesity, would have been seriously difficult to accumulate and maintain for most people, most of the time. This baseline reality is important context because it means obesity, in the modern sense of a chronic, widespread condition affecting a large percentage of a population, almost certainly wasn't common throughout most of human history. But not common is a very different claim from never happened at all, and the actual evidence suggests something a lot more nuanced than a simple, universal absence of excess body fat throughout the ancient world. Let's start with one of the most famous and frequently discussed pieces of evidence in this entire conversation, the so-called Venus figurines, small carved statuettes dating back tens of thousands of years, found across various parts of prehistoric Europe. Many of these figurines depict female figures with notably large breasts, hips, and abdomens, features that have led to extensive debate among archaeologists and researchers about what these figures actually represent and why they were made with these particular proportions. Some researchers have proposed that these figurines might represent an idealized image of fertility and abundance, given how directly connected body fat is to successful pregnancy and lactation in a world without any reliable, consistent food supply. A body carrying visible fat reserves, in an environment where food scarcity was a constant threat, would have signaled something truly valuable. A woman capable of surviving pregnancy and successfully nursing an infant, even through a difficult stretch where food became scarce. Other researchers argue these figurines might be somewhat exaggerated or stylized representations rather than literal depictions of specific individuals, meaning they may reflect a cultural ideal or symbolic concept rather than direct evidence that obesity was actually common or even present in these ancient populations at all. This is worth sitting with for a second because it highlights an important distinction that comes up constantly throughout this whole topic. Evidence of larger body size in ancient art doesn't necessarily prove ancient humans were commonly obese in a literal physical sense. It might instead reflect what these particular cultures valued or idealized symbolically, which isn't necessarily the same thing as evidence of widespread physical reality within the actual population. It's worth pausing here to explain how researchers actually assess something as physically specific as body fat levels. In remains that are sometimes thousands of years old, since it's a lot more involved than simply looking at a skeleton and guessing, bone density scans and measurements of specific skeletal features, including certain markers on weight-bearing joints, can reveal patterns consistent with someone who carried significant excess weight over a sustained period during their life. In cases involving mummified remains specifically, researchers have used CT scanning technology, similar to what's used in modern medical imaging, to examine preserved soft tissue without needing to physically unwrap or damage the mummy itself. This kind of non-invasive scanning has allowed researchers to identify not just body fat distribution, but in some notable cases, evidence of health conditions closely associated with obesity today, including signs of cardiovascular disease and arterial plaque buildup found in Egyptian mummies dating back thousands of years. That last detail is honestly one of the more striking findings in this entire area of research because it suggests some of the health consequences we typically associate with modern lifestyle diseases. Heart disease, specifically tied to excess weight and inactivity, aren't purely products of contemporary living either. Multiple studies scanning ancient Egyptian mummies have found clear evidence of atherosclerosis, meaning hardened, narrowed arteries, in a meaningful percentage of examined individuals, predominantly among the higher status mummies with better preservation and more elaborate burial practices, reinforcing the same overall pattern already established through other lines of evidence. Wealth and reduced physical activity, even thousands of years ago, appear to have carried some of the same physical health consequences we associate with these same lifestyle factors today. Let's move toward more direct physical evidence, though, because skeletal remains offer a much more reliable way to assess actual body composition in specific ancient individuals, rather than relying purely on artistic interpretation. Researchers can examine certain skeletal indicators, including bone density changes, joint wear patterns consistent with carrying excess weight over an extended period, and in rare cases involving exceptionally well-preserved remains. Direct evidence from mummified tissue that allows for a much more direct physical assessment. Some of the most compelling direct evidence actually comes from ancient Egypt, where mummification practices happened to preserve soft tissue in a way that allows researchers to study body composition directly, rather than relying purely on skeletal analysis. Studies analyzing a number of ancient Egyptian mummies have found clear evidence of significant body fat in several individuals, particularly among higher status members of society, including some priests and members of the ruling class. This makes a lot of intuitive sense once you think about it, because higher social status in ancient Egypt would have meant considerably more reliable access to food, alongside a lifestyle that likely involved noticeably less strenuous physical labor compared to farmers, laborers, or soldiers within the same society. This detail is honestly one of the more important pieces of the whole puzzle, because it suggests obesity in the ancient world, when it did occur, was very likely tied closely to social and economic status, rather than being evenly distributed across an entire population. A wealthy Egyptian priest with reliable food access and a relatively sedentary daily routine faced a completely different set of physical circumstances compared to a farmer working the fields under the same broader society and same historical period. Which means the question, did ancient humans become obese, doesn't really have one single, uniform answer even within a single ancient civilization, let alone across the vastly different circumstances found throughout the entire span of human history. There's an entire specialized field worth mentioning here too, called paleopathology, dedicated specifically to studying disease and health conditions in ancient remains. Paleopathologists rely on a combination of skeletal analysis, chemical testing of bone and tissue samples, and increasingly genetic analysis to reconstruct as complete a picture as possible of an ancient individual's health during their lifetime. This field has grown considerably more sophisticated over the past few decades, incorporating advanced imaging technology and biochemical testing methods that simply weren't available to earlier generations of researchers who often had to rely purely on visual skeletal examination alone. This growing sophistication is a big part of why our understanding of ancient obesity and related health conditions has expanded so significantly in recent years, revealing patterns and specific cases that earlier researchers working with more limited tools simply couldn't have detected or confirmed with the same level of confidence. It's also worth mentioning that obesity wasn't the only body composition-related health concern showing up in the ancient world, since the opposite extreme, malnutrition, and severe underweight conditions was almost certainly far more common and widespread across most ancient populations given the constant threat of food scarcity already discussed. This broader context matters because it means ancient societies, much like many societies today, likely dealt with a wide spectrum of body composition outcomes simultaneously, severe malnutrition affecting the poorest and most vulnerable members of a population, alongside occasional cases of excess weight concentrated among the wealthiest and most food-secure individuals within that same society, all existing side by side within the same broader historical period and geographic region. Let's talk about ancient medical texts for a moment, too, because several ancient civilizations left behind written records that directly reference excessive body weight as a recognized health concern, which is a pretty strong piece of evidence in its own right. Ancient Greek physicians, including figures associated with early Hippocratic medical writings, specifically discussed excessive body weight and its associated health risks, recommending changes in diet and exercise as a treatment approach. The fact that ancient physicians felt the need to write about this topic at all strongly suggests it was a real, recognized issue within at least some segment of the population they were treating, likely concentrated among wealthier patients with more reliable food access and less physically demanding daily routines. This detail alone pushes back meaningfully against the assumption that obesity is purely a modern invention. If ancient Greek physicians were writing detailed medical advice about managing excessive body weight thousands of years ago, it means this wasn't some entirely unprecedented problem that suddenly appeared out of nowhere with the arrival of modern industrial food systems. It existed in some form long before that, concentrated specifically among people whose circumstances happened to remove the usual constraints of food scarcity and heavy physical labor that kept most of the ancient population lean by simple necessity. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now, here's an angle worth exploring that connects directly to a broader evolutionary concept, the so-called thrifty gene hypothesis, which proposes that human metabolism evolved specifically to store fat efficiently during periods of food abundance. As a direct survival adaptation against the very real, recurring threat of famine and food scarcity that shaped almost the entirety of human evolutionary history. Under this hypothesis, human bodies aren't poorly designed or somehow malfunctioning when they readily store excess calories as fat. They're doing exactly what evolution shaped them to do, maximizing fat storage whenever food happens to be abundant, as a buffer against the entirely realistic possibility of famine or food shortage in the near future. This evolutionary framing actually helps explain a lot about why obesity became such a widespread issue once reliable, abundant food supplies became broadly available in the modern world. The underlying biological machinery driving efficient fat storage represents an ancient survival mechanism, extremely well suited to an environment of unpredictable food scarcity, one that simply produces very different results once combined with the constant, reliable abundance of calorie-dense food that characterizes modern life for a large percentage of the world's population, rather than any kind of modern malfunction. In a sense, the biological tendency toward efficient fat storage that likely helped ancient humans survive famine periods is the exact same biological tendency contributing to widespread modern obesity, just operating in a radically different food environment than the one it originally evolved to handle. Let's talk about Polynesian and Pacific Islander cultures for a moment too, because they offer a notably different and in some ways more positive historical relationship with larger body size compared to a lot of other regions discussed so far. In several traditional Pacific Island societies, particularly among chiefly or high-status lineages, larger body size was historically viewed as a direct marker of status, health, and social importance, rather than something associated with any negative connotation whatsoever. Some historical accounts from early European explorers and missionaries specifically describe chiefs and high-ranking individuals in various Pacific Island cultures as notably larger in size compared to the general population, a difference these accounts often attributed to differential access to food, reduced physical labor demands placed on high-status individuals, and specific cultural practices in some communities that actively encouraged fattening for individuals of high social rank ahead of important ceremonial events. This cultural pattern adds an important layer of nuance to the whole conversation, because it shows that the relationship between body size, status, and health wasn't understood or valued identically across every ancient and traditional society. While ancient Greek physicians treated excessive weight as a health concern requiring active management, some Pacific Island cultures treated larger body size among high-status individuals as something closer to a truly desirable marker of prestige and abundance, without necessarily framing it as a health problem requiring correction at all. Different cultures, in other words, developed meaningfully different frameworks for understanding and valuing the exact same underlying physical phenomenon, shaped heavily by their own specific social structures, available resources, and cultural priorities. Let's talk about specific historical periods and civilizations that seem to show particularly clear evidence of at least some segment of the population dealing with obesity, because this varies quite a bit depending on the specific historical and cultural context. Ancient Rome, particularly among its wealthiest citizens, developed an elaborate culture around lavish, excessive feasting, with historical accounts describing multi-course banquets involving enormous quantities of rich, calorie-dense food, sometimes stretching across many hours. Some historical Roman writers directly criticized wealthy citizens for what they perceived as excessive eating and resulting physical consequences, suggesting this wasn't just an occasional indulgence, but a recognized, sometimes even mocked, pattern of behavior among a specific segment of Roman high society. Ancient Chinese historical records similarly reference concerns about excessive weight among certain wealthy or high status individuals, alongside detailed dietary and medical advice specifically addressing this issue within traditional Chinese medical texts. Again, this pattern lines up closely with what we've already seen in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Obesity, when it appeared in the ancient world, seems to have been heavily concentrated among populations with reliable food access and reduced physical activity demands, essentially the wealthy and powerful members of a given society, rather than being spread evenly across the entire population regardless of social and economic circumstances. It's worth pausing here to talk about a related and slightly different phenomenon: seasonal weight fluctuation, which appears to have been extremely common throughout most of human history, even among populations that never approached anything resembling clinical obesity. Many historical and even some surviving traditional societies show clear evidence of significant weight gain during periods of seasonal food abundance, followed by considerable weight loss during leaner months or seasons. This pattern of cyclical weight fluctuation, rather than a stable, consistent body weight maintained year-round, represents a notably different relationship with body fat compared to the relatively stable, less seasonally variable body weight most people in developed regions maintain today thanks to consistent, year-round food availability. This detail adds an interesting layer of nuance to the whole conversation, because it suggests that even populations who never developed anything resembling chronic, sustained obesity may have experienced periods of what would, by strict definition, qualify as excess body fat during specific seasons of relative abundance, simply as a normal, expected part of an annual cycle tied closely to food availability, rather than as any kind of ongoing health concern in the way modern obesity typically gets discussed and treated. Let's bring agriculture into this conversation too, because the shift from hunting and gathering towards settled agricultural life likely represents a meaningful turning point in this entire story. Hunter-gatherer populations generally maintained a remarkably varied diet and high level of physical activity, a combination that made excessive fat accumulation considerably less likely across the general population, regardless of social standing within the group, since even higher status individuals within a hunter-gatherer band typically still participated in physically demanding daily activities. Agricultural societies, by contrast, introduced considerably more social stratification, alongside diets increasingly centered around calorie-dense grain staples, and, crucially, created the possibility for certain segments of the population, rulers, priests, wealthy landowners, to access reliable food surpluses while doing considerably less physically demanding daily labor compared to the farmers and laborers actually producing that food. This shift toward agricultural society and its accompanying social stratification appears to line up closely with when we start seeing the clearest historical and archaeological evidence of obesity appearing at all, concentrated specifically among the wealthy and powerful members of these increasingly stratified societies, which suggests obesity, throughout most of recorded human history, stayed closely, consistently tied to the emergence of social inequality itself, appearing specifically once certain individuals gained the ability to access more food than they needed while expending considerably less physical effort than everyone else around them, rather than functioning as some purely biological phenomenon independent of social structure. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full picture turns out to be considerably more layered and interesting than a simple yes or no answer could ever fully capture. Ancient humans throughout the vast majority of human history generally didn't experience obesity on any widespread scale, primarily due to the combination of unpredictable food scarcity and consistently high physical activity demands that characterized daily survival for most people across most historical periods. However, once certain societies developed enough social stratification and agricultural surplus to allow specific segments of the population reliable food access alongside reduced physical activity demands, clear evidence of obesity begins appearing, concentrated specifically among the wealthy and powerful rather than distributed evenly across the general population. This pattern shows up repeatedly across multiple, entirely separate ancient civilizations, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and China among them, each developing their own version of the same basic underlying pattern independently. And underlying all of this sits a deeper evolutionary reality. Human bodies evolved specifically to efficiently store fat during periods of abundance as a buffer against the very real recurring threat of famine, a survival mechanism that served our ancestors extremely well throughout an environment of genuine food scarcity, but that produces very different, often problematic results once combined with the kind of constant, reliable food abundance that characterizes much of the modern world today. It's worth noting one final piece of nuance before wrapping up, because the story of ancient obesity isn't purely one of wealth automatically producing excess weight in every single case. Plenty of wealthy or high status individuals throughout ancient history remained lean despite reliable food access, whether due to personal habits, active lifestyles maintained by choice rather than necessity, cultural or religious practices around moderation, or simply individual metabolic variation. The same kind of variation that means not everyone with abundant food access today becomes obese either. Wealth and reduced physical labor created the conditions that made obesity possible in the ancient world, but they didn't guarantee it in every case, any more than modern food abundance guarantees obesity for every single person living within it today. So the next time obesity gets discussed as though it's some entirely unprecedented modern invention, completely disconnected from anything in humanity's deeper history, it's worth remembering that ancient physicians were writing detailed medical advice about managing excessive body weight thousands of years ago, that wealthy ancient Egyptians and Romans clearly dealt with this issue within their own specific historical context, and that the underlying biological tendency driving modern obesity is actually an ancient survival mechanism, extraordinarily well suited to a world of food scarcity, simply operating in a radically different, much more abundant food environment than the one it originally evolved within. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as seemingly modern as obesity actually traces back through thousands of years of human history, showing up consistently wherever social inequality created pockets of reliable food abundance alongside reduced physical activity, what does that suggest about how deeply our current relationship with food and body weight is actually shaped by ancient evolutionary pressures we're still, in a very real sense, biologically running on today?